Delighted to be here. It's great to be back in Boston. I did a postdoc at the Belfer Center many moons ago, and so have fond memories of my time here. And I'm going to be giving a later lecture today at Harvard, but on a different chapter of the book. So yesterday I gave a talk on the book at UMass Boston on Bangladesh and Myanmar. Today I thought I'd give the Syria-Lebanon case, and later this afternoon I'll talk about Somalia and Ethiopia. Let's see if it's working. There we go. I want to give you a little bit of background on my work in this space, then talk about the approach of the book, discuss the Syria and Lebanon cases, and this is in fact the maiden voyage of talking about this chapter to a public audience. The other presentations I've been giving in this space have been on some of the other chapters, but I thought for y'all I'd do something special. So I also want to talk about the policy implications. I am still half-time at the Department of Defense, so my remarks today don't represent the official views of the U.S. government, but my own personal insights as a scholar. Oops, no worries. I kind of got into this space by accident. In 2004, then Secretary General Kofi Annan had a project on threats, challenges, and change in the UN system. And I was commissioned with former diplomat Nigel Purvis to do a paper on what does climate change mean for the UN system in 2004. And I subsequently got a fellowship to the Belfer Center and thought I really need to deepen my work in this space. And so that led to a paper that came out in 2008 in Security Studies, Who Cares About the Weather, and an accompanying policy paper for the Council on Foreign Relations. I then was part of two research initiatives that were funded by the DoD under the Minerva Initiative, one on climate change and African political stability, a subsequent one on complex emergencies in political stability in Asia, done work for think tanks and academic outlets along the way, and that culminated both in my appointment to the DoD, but also this book. So that's sort of the exegesis for getting into this space. Let me see. I also do work in other related work on social movements and clean energy transition and climate governance. So for those who are interested, happy to address any of those questions in the Q&A. But the animating idea for this project goes back to a debate that happened in the 1990s between Mark Levy and Tad Homer-Dixon. So some of you might be familiar with the early research on environmental security that happened in the 1990s. Tad Homer-Dixon, the Canadian scholar, was leading a research program, mostly of single cases that were trying to trace the relationship between environmental degradation and violent conflict. And Mark Levy pointed out, he said, the more logical research strategy under the circumstances would be to compare societies facing similar environmental problems but exhibiting different levels of violent conflict. That would permit some precision in identifying the conditions under which environmental degradation generates violent conflict and when it does not. And as far as I could tell, nobody ever took Mark up on that research challenge of trying to identify paired cases that had similar environmental exposure but different security outcomes. And I thought that would make a good book, especially as the new literature on climate and security emerged in the 2000s. A lot of it was quantitative, and it's hard to read a 200-page book of regression tables. And so I thought paired cases would make for a better book in this space. And so that's what I set out to do. So that animated the research question, under what conditions will climate hazard / change lead to negative security outcomes? And I'm very specific about those sets of terms, and I hope it'll become clear in the conversation why I framed it as such, because I'm interested in doing a bit of broadening both of our understanding of security and beyond that. So let me move on to the next slide. So this is the basic approach of the book. It's paired cases, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of these in turn. That has broad geographic coverage. So a lot of this literature that emerged in the 2010s was on Africa. I wanted to have wider geographic coverage than that. I wanted to broaden our understanding of security, not to go too far in the direction of human security, but a little bit wider aperture than just violent conflict, and I'll talk about that. I also wanted a general argument that would explain a range of security outcomes, including but not limited to violent conflict, which may be hubris on my part, but I went ahead and did it anyway. And I also wanted to unpack the causal mechanisms. As I said, a lot of the work in this space has been quantitative and correlations, but hasn't done the work to try to connect cause and effect carefully. And I tried to do that in this project. So as I said, I set out to do paired cases. Why did you have famine in Somalia after exposure to severe drought, but not in neighboring Ethiopia? Why did you have a civil war in Syria after drought, but not in neighboring Lebanon? Why did you have severe loss of life in Myanmar after exposure to a severe cyclone in Myanmar, but not in neighboring Bangladesh and India? And I also tried to take advantage of within case variation. So for some folks who are old enough in this room, you may remember the early 1980s where Ethiopia had a devastating drought that killed hundreds of thousands of people alongside conflict. Now, up until recent turn, the last couple of years in Ethiopia, when there were severe droughts, hardly anybody died. And so how do we account for that? Bangladesh, if people are familiar, going back to its founding, when it cleaved from Pakistan, it had a severe cyclone that killed on the order of 300,000 people, major reason for secession. But by the 2010s, major cyclones, hardly anybody dies in Bangladesh. How do we account for that? So that's the within case variation in the book as well. I'm going to focus on Syria, Lebanon today, as I said, but I'm happy to talk about the other chapters. So here I try to broaden the notion of security. And for folks in this room, won't be surprised, the conventional understandings of security problems typically are ones where there's agency by some armed external attacker against another state, or it could be internal to a state. But there's been a broadening of the notion of security to countenance other kinds of problems that rise to the level of what we call security problems. And that has to do with not the agency of an attacker, but the severity of the threat. And it's for this reason that problems like the COVID-19 pandemic or the Ebola crisis before it, or problems like climate change rise to the level of security problems because of the potential severity of their impacts. And those severity of impacts include large-scale loss of life. And so in my mind, it's not the agency of an external attacker that matters, but it's the severity of the threat. I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. And so if climate change leads to and contributes to more extreme weather events that then have the potential to kill large numbers of people or escalate into wider political instability and conflict, then those rise to the level of security problems in my mind. And that's the argument that I make here. So what's the argument more specifically in terms of why you have security problems in some places and not others? And so I have a kind of three-part argument. I'll discuss them briefly and then unpack them. The first is state capacity. And here I'm talking about infrastructural capacity to deliver services. So states with low capacity will have more trouble responding to climate hazards. The second dimension, and I'll say more about each of them in a second. The second is a degree of political inclusion. So states with politically exclusive regimes are less likely to respond to climate hazards with support for all at-risk groups. So if the first gets at the ability of states to respond to climate hazards, the second gets at their willingness. But there's a third dimension, which is the role of international assistance. And that's where states that block foreign assistance or allocate it in biased manners are likely to have worse outcomes. So let me walk through each of these pieces in turn and then put them all back together. So states need to be able to mobilize resources and carry out service delivery to prepare for and respond to climate hazards. And not all states are equally capable in that manner. And drawing on the work of Fukuyama, Michael Mann, late Andrew Price Smith, among others, to get at this infrastructural capacity, which I distinguish from coercive capacity, although I recognize there may be some ambiguity in the text about that. We can talk about that in the Q&A. Let me move to the second factor, which is political inclusion. So here I'm thinking in drawing on the work of Acemoglu and Robinson, Douglas North, Colin Call, Cullen Hendricks, Nina von Exkull, and others. There's the kind of classic argument from Amartya Sen that you hardly ever have or never have famines in democracies. And I don't think regime type is as interesting a delimiter for this space as the degree of political inclusion or exclusion. And here it's representation of all at-risk groups in government that I think is important. And you have societies where large proportions of the populace are not represented in government, their needs are likely to be ignored or actively discriminated against by the governing regime. And that would mean in the event of climate hazard exposure, more suffering, but it also can be the seeds of grievance for those key groups who are left out of decision making to, want to potentially violently seize the state. And so if we think of sort of state stability as a function of sort of elite condominiums of groups in society, that can break down if key groups are left out and their needs are not addressed. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. But the last dimension is international assistance. And here I'm not simply thinking about overseas development assistance, but I'm also thinking about humanitarian assistance, which often aren't tracked in the same budgets, that come in different ways. And they can, in the immediate aftermath of exposure to a climate hazard, flow in emergency settings and compensate for state weakness. It can also, over time, buttress state capacity and build it. So through investments in development assistance, for example, can build state capacity and help compensate for weak states that otherwise might not have the internal resources. So that's the argument that I make here about the role of foreign assistance. So let me put all those pieces together. There are worst case scenarios of low capacity states with high political exclusion that block foreign aid or deliver it in a one-sided manner. And then there are best case scenarios of high capacity states with high political inclusion who receive aid and distribute broadly to all social groups. In between, there are a number of mixed cases, and I think the Syria and Lebanon cases are a little murkier and more mixed than some of the others in the book, which presents its own challenges in terms of analysis, but at least that's the sort of typology. All right, so as I mentioned before, I try to diagram causal pathways, and I do it in a relatively simple way. This is a somewhat more complex one, but start out with the climate hazard, like a drought or severe cyclone. It'll have societal impacts on lives and livelihoods. That in turn may lead to people. In this case, I've added the migration as an extra step because that was relevant in the Syria case. In some of the other examples, it's a simpler causal chain where it just ends in either a humanitarian emergency or it ends in civil communal conflict. In this case, I've added migration. There are steps along the way in terms of demands for redress and local contention, like either in the immediate aftermath of a storm or a drought, people are asking for help from the government. The government has an opportunity to respond. Some of these can be telescoped in quite a short amount of time. Others are lengthier, depending on whether it's a swift onset hazard like a storm or a slow onset one like a drought. The government has at its disposal whatever capacity it has or the degree of political inclusion. That can be buttressed with international assistance at that time. If things go badly, it may end up either in a humanitarian emergency or civil or communal conflict. This is at least a relatively simple diagram of the pathways to negative security outcomes. If you're familiar with the ones from Tad Homer Dixon from the 90s, there are lots of recursive loops, and it's a more focused on a longer period of time. This is more focused on short-run climate hazard exposure, and we can talk about why that is. The method of each chapter is to compare the two cases to each other and also exploit within case variation. I need a document that both faced similar climate hazards and then code the key variables of capacity, inclusion, and assistance, and then to be a good or at least adequate social scientist, try to address alternative explanations. So that's what I try to do in each of the chapters. So let me get into the Syria-Lebanon case. Here were my expectations going in, that you had severe droughts in the 2006-2010 period that affected both countries. Slight differences in state capacity, a weaker infrastructural capacity of the Syrian state compared to Lebanon, much more exclusive regime in Syria compared to Lebanon, although Lebanon is inclusive, but only somewhat, and I'll talk about that. International assistance, limited access in the case of Syria, broader access and delivery on the part of Lebanon. Those were at least my expectations going in. So here's what I found. First, I have to document hazard exposure, and I need to connect it to potential security outcomes through impacts on lives and livelihoods. Now, I say climate hazards rather than climate change. for a reason in that it's very difficult to attribute any single event like a drought to anthropogenic climate change. The science of attribution studies has matured, and so there is work that suggests that the drought that affected the Levant in the 2006-10 period was made more likely by climate change. But on some level, it's not necessary for the argument to determine that it was so, in that what we typically do in this field is to look for proxies for the kinds of effects that we expect climate change will have in the future. So whether or not any specific historical extreme weather event was made more likely by climate change isn't really all that important, because it's indicative of the kinds of effects we expect to see down the road. And so, so on some level, I'm talking about these climate hazards that may or may not be directly attributable to anthropogenic climate change, but it's indicative of the kinds of effects we expect to see in the future. So climate scientists have said before the Syrian uprising that began in 2011, the Greater Fertile Crescent experienced the most severe drought in the instrumental record. Or put another way, the 1998-2012 period was the driest 15-year period in the last 900 years. So indications that this was a very severe drought. I try and do this in different ways with both rainfall and temperature data. So for rainfall, data shows that the 2006 to 2009 period were below normal growing season rainfall years in Syria, with 2008 being the below normal for the growing season being the worst, and the worst since 1973. Similarly, in Lebanon's case, 4 continuous years of below normal rainfall for the growing season between 2007 and 2010, 2008 being below average growing season rainfall for the previous 20 years, largest negative deviation in rainfall since 1973. So similar magnitude of rainfall deviations. I also try in the book to get at it with maps. So these are the subnational, the geography of where agricultural stress was highest. So in the northeast of the country, in Al-Hasaka region, Raqqa, Aleppo, and then there were parts in the central of the country in the far south. The origins of the early protest movement, if people are familiar, was in the south, but most of the effects were felt in the northeast. And whereas in Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, there were 85% of the land in parts of that area were highly affected by drought. And that shows up in some indicators of agricultural production. So we see a significant decline in both countries, not quite in the same year, 2008 in Syria, 2010 in Lebanon. Abnormally high temperature coincided with this drought period in Lebanon context. And so then I try to trace through how that shows up in terms of impacts. UN assessment suggested that 1.3 million people were affected by drought in Syria, with 800,000 severely affected, and that translated into people living on bread and sugar tea for extensive periods of time. Large-scale decline in livestock levels from 21 million to between 14 and 16 million. In the Lebanon context, the evidence that I have here doesn't show up in terms of severe impacts on farming and livelihoods in quite the same way. What it does show up in is steep increases in urban food prices. And so we can talk about whether, what that means for the kind of comparability of the cases, but at least that's the evidence that I discuss in the book. So in one case, the problems from the agricultural sector escalate into civil war, and I'm going to try and trace through to the extent we have some reading of how that happened in the Syrian context. And the other, despite many problems, Lebanon doesn't experience of civil war. So what explains those contrasting fortunes? So here's where my argument comes in. I suggest that this combination of capacity, inclusion, and assistance. And I start with some basic indicators of state capacity, drawing from World Bank indicators of government effectiveness. I also look at control of corruption and regulatory capacity. On some level, this suggests, even in the lead up to the Civil War, this metric, these are based on investor confidence metrics, and these may be somewhat problematic proxies. Because on some level, in the lead up to the civil war in Syria, it looks like there's some convergence in government effectiveness. And I think what is happening here is that there was a pro-market liberalization attempt by the Assad regime, which on some level made Western or international investors more sanguine about the prospects for change in Syria that actually had deleterious effects on the rural sector, but were seen by international investors positively. I think the upshot of this, for my purposes, is that Lebanon had marginally better government effectiveness in the lead up to the drought, but not necessarily by a whole lot, at least by these kind of conventional metrics. I also look at metrics of bureaucratic quality from a similar investor group surveys, PRS group. But I also then try to trace through what does this mean for particular policies that are more relevant to the response to drought, right? And so mostly this is focused on inputs into policy. And so in the Syrian case, the majority of staff in the ministries of agriculture and irrigation had barely finished secondary school, and only a small minority had a university degree. So this gets at some sense of like what kinds of capacity do they have to respond to the drought. But it wasn't necessarily all that much better in the Lebanon case. And so the World Bank did an evaluation of Lebanon's drought response. This was a little bit later, but they said the country lacked a drought emergency plan. These problems persisted after the 2014 drought, let alone earlier droughts. So core conclusions that there was no concerted drought management effort, that the country did not prioritize drought risk management, and had no drought monitoring system. So maybe some marginal differences in state capacity when we look at general metrics, some comparable problems on some level when we look at drought preparedness and response. I look at some other metrics. These are more a little bit sort of downstream metrics that both countries had pursued sort of elaborate policies of subsidies for the agricultural sector to become more agriculturally independent, but through a support for water-intensive agricultural products like wheat in a very arid part of the world. And in Syria's case, that was having a pretty steep impact on budgets in the lead up to their civil war, in that they were spending 4% of their GDP, including diesel subsidies, and the diesel subsidies were important for being able to power the irrigation pumps that were irrigating at least half the wheat crop, fertilizer and seed subsidies, and credit. So that's about 4% of their GDP that was becoming unsustainable in the lead up to the crisis, and that were cut about 2 years before the Civil War set off. And so when I look at the comparison with the Lebanon case, the degree of subsidies both for producer groups and for consumers, because there were subsidies on both ends, both to grow the wheat and to keep bread prices down for urban consumers, that was never more than about 0.21% of the country's GDP. Whether or not that on some level is a proxy for state capacity, we can talk about, but these were sort of ways that I try to get at in the specific realm that's relevant to drought and water management and agriculture, differential policies of the, and this suggests that more problems on the Syrian side. They also made other strategic choices that may also be related to the quality and capacity of that staff that I mentioned earlier that were poorly trained. In the case of Syria, which had been a wheat exporter right up until the Syrian civil war, they decided for some God-foreseen reason to sell off all of their wheat reserves in 2006. And so then when you had the drought a couple years later, they were faced with the prospect of having to import wheat. So all of this is to suggest some differences in capacity between Syria and Lebanon, but perhaps not as stark as we see in some of the other cases that I talk about in the book. But a more potent difference between the two countries on some level has to do with political inclusion, although there's still problems on the Lebanese side, but certainly very severe problems on the Syrian side. So if we look at conventional metrics of political exclusion, like the ethnic power relations data set, the minority Alawites have been the dominant partner in government since 1970. Other ethnic groups, which make up 86% of the population, have been excluded, right? But in Lebanon's case, which has different political system. We'll talk about in a second. No time since 1946 has Lebanon ever had more than 13% of the population excluded from political representation, even during the lengthy civil war period. A look at other metrics if we think of other metrics of political inclusion beyond the ethnic power relations data set, the VDEM project looks at social exclusion, which gets at sort of differential access to services. And if we think of Denmark as maybe a paragon of equality on some level, often in development circles we talk about trying to get to Denmark. Syria is far higher than Lebanon, certainly, vast differences than Denmark, but Lebanon's sort of an intermediate case on that score. But there's a sort of more nuanced portrait that I try to talk about in the text, that the government had maintained some political stability under the Assad regime, Assad the father, by balancing interest groups and trying to get some buy-in even from the groups that weren't formally represented in government through sort of preferential access to services and resources. So Kadur and Mazur note, the regime has played a subtle game of balancing and securing the interests of other segments. The general quiescence of the Sunni business classes of Aleppo and Damascus during the uprising is clear evidence of this fact. But Assad, the son, had more problems in sort of being able to maintain this sort of clientelist policy base as the resources of the country declined. And this is related to the issue that I talked about before with the high subsidy regime. They weren't able to maintain that. And so in the lead up to the civil war and in the wake of the drought, Hinnebusch describes the deterioration in the social base of the regime as it neglected its former compact with the largely Sunni peasantry. So in addition to the support for sort of business groups, there had been sort of trade-off and an agreement with the kind of Sunni peasants that will give you subsidized resources to be able to continue to farm. They couldn't do that in the same way, so the structural balance in the regime was shifting towards patrimonial authority at the expense of bureaucratic and inclusionary capacity. And so it was more of a kind of effort to reward selected business groups that were more in favor of Assad, the son, and led to some of the deleterious consequences later on. In Lebanon's case, their government structure has been one of power sharing. They've tried to maintain a delicate balance among the country's 18 different religious groups or confessions, some periods more successful than others. But as I talk about in the book, that sort of quasi-inclusionary dynamic has problems of its own in which the elites are somewhat predatory on the populace as a whole. And so you've had, I don't know if anybody's followed like the garbage crisis in Lebanon, where different ethnic groups get contracts for picking up the trash in different neighborhoods, and then neither of them seem to pick up the trash for any of their associated political bases of support, and then end up dumping it in the ocean or something terrible, and you end up with sort of outcomes that are burbling beneath the surface that may have not yet escalated into civil war, but are problematic in their own right. But that, nonetheless, this confessional system, at least since the last civil war, has led some analysts to think of it as this is something of a strength. The Lebanese political system is definitely in need of a raft of political reforms, but the basic inclusiveness of the system remains a key bulwark, at least against serious civil conflict of the kind we see in several neighboring Arab countries. So that's at least my reading of inclusion in this case, that there are some differences. But stark in the case of Syria, more inclusive in the case of Lebanon, but still some problems. The last area that I talk about is the role of international assistance. And here, neither of these countries is all that dependent on foreign aid, right? So I just contrast both of the countries with Ethiopia, which is another chapter in the book, which is far more dependent on foreign aid. So foreign aid isn't really a story in this particular book or chapter, but the role of diaspora remittances is. And so you can see that compared to Syria and Ethiopia, actually, sorry, this is a development assistance. This is development assistance as a share of GDP. This is the same slide. Let me go to the next one. I put in the wrong graphic for that one. What I meant to have is a graphic that showed a higher proportion of remittances go to Lebanon than either Syria or Ethiopia. But there are specific ways in which international assistance played a role in this case that I think are relevant, in that in the wake of the drought, the UN issued an appeal for resources for the Northeast that the Syrian government signed off on. Just 5.4 million of the 24.4 million requested in 2008 was provided by the international community. And then the next year they had another appeal and only a third of that was provided. So it suggests to me, and the US didn't contribute to either effort, and there were some WikiLeaks cables that came out that suggested the US was debating whether or not to contribute and was wanted to see more far-reaching efforts by Syria to say that it was a severe emergency, which they weren't willing to do. But for whatever reason, the US government wasn't willing to support and crowd in international assistance, and so the effort was vastly underfunded. Now, on the Lebanese side, they didn't have any equivalent drought appeal, but they did have one after refugee crisis related to attacks by Israel in Lebanon. And that appeal was far more successful. So slightly different issue space, and we might think that the, moral compellingness of refugees displaced by conflict is different. But in any case, what this suggests to me is neither of these two countries was especially reliant on foreign aid. Lebanon had higher access to remittances, but in specific episodes where there were appeals to respond to crises in both countries, Syria was already something of an international pariah even before the drought, whereas Lebanon was still relatively in favor and could count on international resources when asked. Okay, so let me put the pieces together. And I'm going to focus on Syria because it's a more complex and difficult case. It's a longer causal chain than some of the other chapters. And it's actually been a source of contention for people who might be familiar with it, in that there have been, think tanks that have claimed, the Syrian civil war was caused, or one of the major causes of the Syrian civil war was drought. And there are other scholars like Jan Selby and Marwa Dawoudi at Georgetown, who basically said, no, it was other things. It's all governance all the way down. Jan Selby and others have said there wasn't a big drought. There weren't that many people that were displaced. They didn't end up protesting. What do we make of that discrepant evidence? And so I try and go through all of the different authors who've weighed in this space and see what we can make of it. So Tobias Ide had some interesting remarks in an exchange where he said there's good evidence to suggest that the drought did displace large numbers of people from the north of Syria to southern and western cities. And there are debates about how many it was. On the high side, people are claiming as many as 1.5 million. It's probably still several hundred thousands. And he said it's still very likely that several hundred thousands of additional people migrated from the drought-affected areas to the outskirts of urban centers. And it's probably more significant than folks like Jan Selby give it credit for. And what does that mean? How does that translate into something that's relevant to the start of the Civil War? Hinnebusch says, in Daraa, formerly a base of the Ba'ath, where the protests began, the loss of work opportunities in Lebanon, corruption, and drought had encouraged Salafism among unemployed youth. Schmidt says the drought-ravaged Northeast led to mass migration to crowded slums in the north, especially Idlib and Aleppo. It was also especially from those segments and places that the opposition militias recruited its greatest number and most dedicated activists. I go through about 3 or 4 other authors that make similar claims, but there's still a bit of hand-waviness about what is our sense of the representation in those protests, because there are other countervailing views. So Ababsa, she makes the argument that those displaced populations didn't take part in the protests, right? They did not take part in the revolts in Daraa and the coast, being too poor to get politicized, according to many observers. But then, nevertheless, the presence of so many displaced peasants, proof of the failure of the Jazeera development, was an important context element in which the revolts occurred. So, and you have other scholars sort of on that side who are saying, but they didn't take part in the protests early on. There are other scholars who provide additional nuance and countervailing views. So Ash and Obradovich have a paper where they're looking at lights at night to show before and after the drought, where protests were most likely to be observed. And so protests were less likely to be observed in the areas that had outmigration, and more likely to be observed in these peri-urban areas that experienced in-migration. But then when you look at the actual substance of people's protest activities, drought doesn't come up. So what do we make of that? So my additional reflections that I talk about in the chapter suggest it's not quite clear what social groups were the main protagonist in anti-government activity. My sense is that you had a cohort of several 100,000 people in the outskirts of major cities who were potentially recruitable to participate in protests, particularly as their co-ethnics, mostly Sunnis, were being repressed violently. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, like, how important is that recruitable mass of several 100,000 people, many of them young men who don't have basis of employment? How important is that as a base for adding into the masses of people that were potentially mobilizable for the uprising? So Selby, said, but there were lots of other people already there, returning migrants from Lebanon. There had already been internal migration within the country. So did a pulse of 200,000 to 500,000 people in 2008, 2009 make much of a difference to the uprising? I tend to think, maybe because I want to think that's true, I think that it's important, but on some level, that's as far as we can get with this particular case, given the evidence that's available. Now, on the Lebanese side, in the alternative explanation section, and I'll close in a second, is that, the arguments are numerous about maybe these cases are too different from each other. Like, the impacts of drought don't show up in the record as quite as severe, so it doesn't lead to the kinds of social consequences that we saw in Syria that were translatable into migration, protest, and conflict. Lebanon had a recent memory of civil war that was still salient, that may have dampened enthusiasm for escalation. But I also reflect on Lebanon's own precariousness. So if you've followed, like, the fertilizer explosion that happened in 2020, or the garbage crisis, or any number of things, that Lebanon's ability to escape conflict and return to civil war may be a function of luck at this point. That the problems of the sort of elite groups on all sides being somewhat predatory and not doing service delivery for the masses is something that has created large-scale youth movement protests that may be somewhat disconnected from the sort of ability of elites to sort of lead their social groups and avoid conflict, and could escalate to be something that they can't control one day. So there are other arguments to talk about, governance factors that are the real drivers of Syria's civil war as opposed to the drought. But I was a student of Andy Bennett's at Georgetown, and his work on process tracing and case study methods suggests that qualitative methods don't give us as much purchase on relative causal weight as we might like in complex causality situations. I think disagreements between scholars like Jan Selby and me and others about the relative causal importance of drought to the conflict in Syria might be fundamentally irreconcilable. It has to do with sort of matters of taste and what causal narrative you're trying to tell. And the fact is that you had a devastating drought in Syria that preceded the civil war, that dislocated large numbers of people, and you had a recruitable mass of young men that was expanded in the peri-urban areas. That if we were to take that away, would Syria still have had a civil war? Very well might have. If we were to change the path of history, or the U.S. had contributed to international efforts to dampen the drought, would Syria's civil war still have happened? Again, still very well might be overdetermined. But those were sort of paths that did in fact happen. And from my we couldn't tell the story of serious civil war without talking about the drought. Whether or not you want to ascribe it to having a major causal impact or a minor one is kind of subject to maybe one's tastes. Last thing I'd say, and this is really focused on other chapters, less so this particular one, but there are certain policy implications. In the other chapters, I talk about how focused investments in Bangladesh and Ethiopia, despite their exposure to severe droughts in the case of Ethiopia or severe cyclones in the case of Bangladesh, at relatively low levels of income, they've been able to reduce mortality from those particular problems, and with the help of foreign assistance. And it suggests that foreign actors, well-meaning foreign actors, can help address the problems that are likely to become worse with climate change by helping countries become more resilient and to adapt to this problem. And that's a salutary lesson on some level, that we don't necessarily have to accept that countries are consigned to have terrible outcomes in a world in which there are more severe droughts and cyclonic activity, because that hasn't been the case in some of these other countries where they've made judicious use of foreign aid in targeted areas to build state capacity. But I also recognize that it's much harder for external actors to have much a role shaping political inclusion. And so we need to have a kind of theory of state building if we're well-meaning external do-gooders wanting to help another country. What's our understanding of state cohesion and state building in that particular locality, and what are the possibilities for influence, but also the limits as well? So I'm going to stop there. Happy to talk more about this case, talk about the other cases, or to the extent that I'm able to talk about my work in the Pentagon. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, everyone, let's see. Nick Ackert, I see your hand first. Everyone else keep your hands up.
Hi, Josh. My name is Nick Ackert. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in the program. This was really interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. So the heart of the argument, as I understand it, is that sort of exogenous environmental conditions can really stoke long-term grievances, and that this is sort of funneled through a series of intermediary variables, and that the environment plays some role actually in lowering the threshold for conflict, unless the state can do something internally to kind of contain it. And one way I thought of summarizing that was sort of a motives argument, but I also think that there may be an opportunity story here as well, where some kinds of environmental conditions are actually really good for rebel groups. And I'm thinking Burma is potentially an example of this. Cyclone Nargis hits in 2008. And the rebels are like, great, the Burmese government doesn't want the US anywhere near this because they're worried about foreign influence operations. The roads and other sorts of things that the governments usually use to repress them are down. And they can run a fabulous propaganda campaign. So there's sort of like a greed or a chance story here. So I'm wondering what you're thinking about that, and also whether or not the same kind of environmental effect might affect the state and potentially subversive actors differently. And is there sort of like a heterogeneous treatment thing here going on?
Yeah, I think there's I think that has some validity in that these extreme weather events can, over the long run, degrade state capacity to repress violence in a couple of different ways. One, it could reduce tax revenue that then could fund militaries. So I guess it depends on where you put that. Do you put that on the sort of opportunities ledger, in that that opens up more space for the rebel groups to oppose the state? I mean, there are ways in which these severe weather impacts can have differential effects on. So Tobias Ede has a paper that's coming out in his book and international security that suggests that sometimes disasters like this can enhance the opportunities for rebel groups, by making it harder for the state to repress violence across its entire domain. In other cases, it has a deleterious impact on their capacity because they themselves are heavily devastated by these. So that's at least been the argument that was made after the 2004 tsunami, which wasn't climate related, but maybe led to some of the ending of hostilities in parts of Indonesia. So there may be a more variegated story that I'm not fully capturing in this account, that he does it with QCA analysis. And I think that may be an important complement to the argument that I'm making here.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Kenoi.
Sure. Following up on Nick's comment, Nick made reference to heterogeneous treatment effects, which could also be referred to potentially as the dark side of the force.
Yeah.
So you started with Dixon,
Yeah.
and that's the bright side of the force.
Right.
He's the good guy talking about mitigating terrible consequences.
Right.
But Nick
Right.
is representative of current thinking on these issues.
Right.
And your account suggested that regimes that were non-inclusive and undemocratic,
Yeah.
with more limited capacity, would probably not fare well in the presence of climate change.
Right.
That the consequences for them would be more severe, their capability for dealing with it would be less.
Right.
Frankly speaking, our government does have a tradition of trying to topple such regimes.
Right.
Okay. We could be talking, well, okay, there are a lot of examples.
Yeah.
So in your dealings within the Pentagon
Mm-hmm.
and intelligence circles
Yeah.
in Washington, has there been discussion of the dark side of the force, the ways that climate change may enhance American security as seen by some segments
Right.
of the national security community? Because its differential effects
Yeah.
are going to be greater on regimes that we actually tend to like to topple.
Yeah. I think if there were, I probably wouldn't talk about it. I mean, I think at most there's an awareness of the political opportunities or the national security opportunities may change for the U.S., but I don't think that there's quite that level of nefariousness in the way people are interpreting these signals of climate change. But that's,
If we engage in sanctions to reduce GDP, if we looked at the differential effects on supporters and opponents of regimes,
yeah,
then the distributional implications of drought and climate change and temperature elevation would seem to be within scope.
I think that's plausible. I don't think that's where the gravity of where discussion in this field has gone on some level, because there's probably some squeamishness about going there but if you look at Undersecretary Colin Call's formal remarks, he had to New America Foundation in a public setting. What he did say is that countries that are best prepared to deal with climate change are going to have better outcomes in terms of national security and in wider strategic considerations. And so on some level, whether or not the U.S. wants to seize upon that for other purposes, that may be happening, but not something I would comment on. Yeah.
Thank you. I would also do not wish to impute to Nick
Yeah.
those thoughts.
Right.
Kunal.
Thank you. Since I expected that we'll get something about climate change as an independent variable for negative security outcomes,
Yeah.
but it seemed to me like the state capacity and inclusive institutions are the independent variables, and climate change is only a triggering element after which these other variables come into play.
Right.
Now, and how strong is this as a triggering element? How much is climate hazard as a determinant of conflict? It is difficult to understand from this research design. So, have you looked in other parts of the book at two states with similar institutions and similar capacity, but one facing more climate hazards and thus facing more conflicts?
Yeah. That's not exactly the way I approached it here. I approached it in terms of two facing similar climatic hazard exposure, but differences in governance, either inclusiveness or capacity. And so that may be another research design that might be interesting to pursue. I didn't, though, for this project. I kind of followed Mark Levy's guidance back in the day. But this question of kind of, we think of climate change as a permanent impact on the long-run development capacities of countries. And what I focus on are relatively short-run climate hazard exposure. And so as I talk about in the later chapters and in a forthcoming piece in PS, the field hasn't really come to grips with how to deal with something that's likely to lead to permanent changes in countries' GDP potential because their capacity for agriculture is greatly diminished. I say permanent, but at least over the next 50 to 100 years, deteriorating circumstances that will impinge on their ability to provide for their needs of their populace, pay for their militaries, and so on. We haven't really got great analytical tools to get at that. And so on some level, I think that's a necessary. There's a paper by Cullen Hendricks and Sarah Glazer that's early in this space called Trends and Triggers. And most of the work in this space is focused on climate change and hazards as triggering for conflict, but not in that sort of trend analysis for long-run forces. And there's other work that kind of gets at the role of long-run forces that may then show up in societal outcomes. I'm thinking about Asamoah and Robinson's work on disease vectors in colonial Africa and how that shows up in later political institutions like after decolonization because of the kinds of economic systems that could be established in countries that had high disease vectors. You could have limited settler colonies and limited sort of replication of imperial political institutions, whereas in other countries that had lower disease mortality, you had higher settler populations, and then they created political institutions that looked more like where the colonists had come from. Those had long-running effects and then may show up in later GDP and development trajectories or political violence later on. And I think climate change is likely to have effects like that, but we don't really have good analytical strategies to try to get at those since we're largely looking to a future problem. And if we're looking for past analogs, like we may have to go to 200 or 300 years ago or several thousand years ago to find comparable examples in the historical record for what climate did to previous societies, but then they had such different adaptive capacities that we might not think that's very relevant to the current context. Anyway, long-winded answer of trying to get at your question, but thanks.
Let's see, Nina Miller.
Sure. Thank you so much. This was really interesting. This might be a bit of a meandering question, but I'll try to focus it. I guess I'm curious about the political effects of climate hazards. And by that I mean, in your research design and especially the Syria case, you focused a lot on the very material effects of whether we can identify who moved where and who was affected by the drought. And that you seem to sort of find an absence of these symbolic effects, that people didn't refer to climate as a mobilizing grievance. It didn't really show up in the narratives about the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And so as we think of other hazards, I guess two come to mind, thinking about COVID-19, which maybe isn't quite a climate hazard, but has similar, you could think about it in a similar way, or something like Hurricane Katrina. It seems like there's a political interpretation of it that doesn't necessarily line up with the material effects. And if you look across, democracies, you see very different responses to COVID. If you look at pre-pandemic ratings, the US was expected to have a fantastic response to COVID, and then in a lot of ways didn't. So I guess when you think about the role of grievances or the symbolic effects, is that different than the material effects? Does it matter? I feel there's something useful in that question.
Yeah, so I thought a lot about this. Is it fatal on some level for the argument that if people didn't articulate drought as one of the reasons for protesting early on in Syria, is that fatal to the argument that the drought didn't have something to do with the protest? And I don't think it is. And a former student of mine, Todd Smith, did a paper on food protests, and he found a correlation even in places where the actual reasons for their protest didn't articulate food. It had to do with the material effects on food prices of impact of rainfall. So it's sort of rainfall, leads to higher food prices, which is mediated by state policies like subsidies that, in some states it ends up translating into higher food prices, in other places it doesn't. But people might get out on the streets and protest, not articulating food as one of the reasons for protests, but but it may show up in other ways in terms of, they may be protesting for higher wages. They're not saying, higher bread prices are what are the reason why I'm out on the street, but it's part of the sort of milieu of grievances that they have. And so I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think we shouldn't necessarily accept the fact that if people don't articulate climate as one of the reasons why they're out there in contestation with the state for any reason, that it isn't somehow relevant to the experience. I'm having difficulty translating that to the comments about Katrina and COVID. Maybe in some of those episodes, people are responding and explicitly referencing that source material, but those problems can have dislocative effects that show up in other kinds of activities, even if the actors themselves aren't consciously talking about it. And I think that's in some cases they are, but in other cases they're not. But it doesn't mean that it wasn't somehow important to understanding that situation. And we can talk more about that, but I hope that gives a little bit of a response to your question. Thanks.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe looking to the future more. I can envision cases, if you think about Pacific Islands, that are being highly impacted by climate change, are going to face, flooding and actively losing their land. And I think there's a pretty broad public awareness that this is not their fault and that climate change is primarily being driven by others, and that this is a direct effect of climate change that they're experiencing. And so in cases like that, I guess I would not expect there to be so much protest against the government, and more like a sense that they're besieged by the rest of the world that is failing them somehow, and that might have different political consequences.
Yeah, I think it's true that, so it's interesting that once people are aware of climate change as a mobilizable problem around which they can use it as an access for potentially getting resources, then you've seen state governments instrumentalize the problem and try to reframe it and say, and this is one of the challenges I think of people's worry about saying climate change is a cause of conflict, is that it sort of lets governments off the hook for bad policy, and they can ascribe it to some international force that's outside of their own control. And so you do see whether it be Pacific Island states or others saying we're facing problems that are not of our own making. And in the case of Pacific Islands, that's probably right. In the case of Syria, for example, there's an external effect of drought, but it is made much worse by mismanagement of the resources that they did have at their disposal. And so I think there's a way to talk about, climate as an independent force in its own right, but that converges with other governance deficits to make problems worse without letting governments off the hook. But I do think that there's the potential now for this problem to be used as a symbolic resource by affected countries to try to extract resources from others. But mostly on some level, there's been a sort of rhetorical effort by developing countries through loss and damage, demands for compensation. And there's been a rhetorical effort by northern countries to say, yes, we will provide you with some compensation, but the actual compensation doesn't materialize. And so it's rhetorical on both sides, but they're very real lived effects for the people on the ground in, those countries that shows up in, over time, potentially existential risk for those countries' ability to continue as free states in the international system because of sea level rise. Sure.
John Haverly?
Hey, Josh. I guess I want to maybe sharpen, or not sharpen, kind of pile on Kudal and Nina's excellent points. It's sort of, all right, capacity, inclusion, assistance, these are things that make states better off to handle situations. And I'm just trying to figure out what is the difference between a climate shock and a financial crisis, an earthquake, a pandemic, and does it matter and why? And then I guess the larger thing to follow up is sort of who are you trying to convince in this book, and what are you trying to convince them of, and why? That's sort of like, because we're talking about a causal story here.
Yeah.
And once you have a causal story, then you can try and convince people of something. I'm trying to figure out who you're trying to convince here.
Right. Great. So, so when we had a previous grant in this space with the Pentagon, Alan Cooperman, graduate of here at MIT, included climate as just yet another shock. In his mind, it wasn't all that dissimilar from economic shocks. So he did a series of papers to look at climate as just another indicative shock. And I haven't spent as much time thinking about, like, is climate different? I mean, on some level, it's if it's part of shocks that are outside of government control, then there may be kinds of shocks that are seen as ones that governments should have been aware of and prepared for, and other kinds of shocks that are sort of like acts of God. So climate may be perceived a bit more like that, that then lets governments off the hook. But I'll have to think about that one a little bit more. In terms of who I'm trying to convince, there's been a divide in the literature, and you see it show up in this case, where people say it's climate that's the driver, whereas other people are saying it's governance and factors all the way down. And what I was trying to do was wed those two strands to say, look, it's climate under certain conditions when you combine it with governance, and try to get beyond this sort of stark divide of at least a cohort in the environmental security literature trying to say it's either climate or it's governance, which I found unsatisfying. So, and it's also speaking to the sort of, people may be familiar with the sort of threat multiplier concept that Sherry Goodman, former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, popularized in the climate security literature, where she basically said, climate is a threat multiplier, maybe not an independent threat on its own, but when combined with other factors, but didn't say much about which other factors matter. And on some level, that's important, because if we're focused on identifying which are the key scope conditions that matter, some of those are more tractable to policy intervention. But if we just basically say all bad things go together, threats multiply, it doesn't give us much indication about what kinds of particular circumstances we should care about. And here, at least, I've put forward an argument that it's capacity inclusion that really matter, and that assistance can have some role, particularly on the capacity side, which maybe gives us some leverage over things that for policy purposes we might have some influence over.
Great president.
So I guess I'm going to echo a couple of comments that were made here, but I guess I have to confess my own sins coming in, which is I think it's an error to kludge together political violence and suffering from an ecological event and try and treat them under the same roof.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the comments I think you've had here are about the basic proposition that we have a lot of theories about civil war, and you're really studying civil war here. And obvious, maybe not the research design you wanted to do, but a kind of an obvious research design that would give you a lot of leverage is, what is the simplest and most basic things the theories about civil conflict say about the outcome of civil conflict? And how does any number of kinds of climactic events affect a key independent variable in that theory? So I would say that the kind of the most widely accepted, but not necessarily fairly agreed hypothesis here is that civil wars break out when the balance of power between the state and its challengers is affected by an exogenous shock.
Right.
This raises the question, very basic one, which is, how does a climactic event in the family affect the balance of power between the state and its potential challengers? That has a presumption that there are some
Yeah.
potential challenges, so you need a measure of that. This would allow you to get to your question of, people have to say that the famine made them mad for it to have been a contributor to conflict.
Right.
Because famine can do two things, right? It can weaken the state and change the balance of power. Maybe the state taxes food and its tax base is eroded, so its coercive capabilities are eroded. Or it could strengthen the challengers.
Yeah.
And some of your story is consistent with a challenger strengthening hypothesis.
Right.
So, mixing up our theories here a little bit, the famine drives a lot of Syrians, most of whom already share a class, economic, religious, ethnic identity, drives them into the towns with a shared experience. Carl Deutsch would call this social mobilization. He would say that people are now socially mobilized for more intense activity, more intense political activity. And in your story, that would make them available for mobilization by extant challengers.
Right.
Right? And especially the young displaced males in the population, who are in some ways the atomic energy of modern politics.
Right.
Young males without. So I'm giving you my story here, and I'm not, maybe I'm going on too long about it, but I wonder if you like to say a bit more about the fundamental going-in decision that you made about treating the different bad experiences that population can have as a consequence of climate change under the same rubric.
Yeah.
That starving to death versus being shot to death by people who were mobilized to pick up guns because they were starving and went somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right. Is this? I'm being really kind of mean here, but I'm saying I think it muddied up your research design, and I wonder if you'd like to reconsider that choice in the next work that you do.
Yeah. No, I think, as I mentioned at the outset, the effort to try to explain a range of security outcomes may be hubris, right? There was some goal to have an argument that could explain a range of security outcomes, even if recognizing that, but the motivation was on some level to elevate some of these other kinds of problems, large-scale humanitarian emergencies, to bring them into conception of security that had been neglected on some level. So now, there may be folks who fundamentally think that's a sort of conceptual stretching of security by saying large-scale humanitarian emergencies don't constitute security threats by conventional measures because you're just focusing on large-scale loss of life. But what we care about is, people who are actively killed by the state or actively killed by rebel movements. In my mind, and I made that argument at the outset, that I think it's the severity of the impacts that matter, and that we've had both drought and cyclones kill hundreds of thousands of people.
You're repeating yourself, and I guess I'm repeating myself.
Yeah.
Right. I'm making a theoretical point, not a values point.
No.
Right. The theoretical point is it's hard to use the same theory to explain the two different kinds of outcomes, and that you need two different theories. It doesn't mean the two theories couldn't coexist in the same book.
Right.
It doesn't mean you couldn't pass one theory over the evidence first and the second theory over the evidence the second time.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is by mixing them up together, you've actually reduced the purchase on the problem that you were trying to get.
Yeah. I think that what I tried to do is, as I said, use the same explanatory framework to get at both of them. And I still think that, there are ways that for other people, for example, like Tobias Ide has focused more narrowly on the way you've articulated the problem in this kind of Civil War context of does the specific hazard episode differentially affect the state and challengers? And you feel free to read his project and think if he's been more successful in that approach. I leave it to others. I still think that the capacity inclusion and the role of assistance here gives us some purchase on this case in ways that weren't obvious at the outset, and that adds something crucial to the debate about the way that drought intersected with these other dynamics in the Syrian case in meaningful ways. But I take that seriously, and you may approach the problem in subsequent work a little differently.
Great, thanks. Wright Smith.
Thank you so much for this presentation. So I'm curious what maybe this gets into what you've done with the Defense Department, but I'm curious what the implication for kind of US force posture and defense planning is. Because if I take maybe the extreme end of viewing this, unless a civil war occurs that has, very, very significantly impacts US interests, which I think frankly most civil wars around the world, for better or worse, just don't.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know is there a takeaway for US defense planning that you think should be factored in, or is this really kind of a story of what US diplomacy should be doing before it rises to the level of a defense issue?
Yeah, I think those are the kinds of issues that we've grappled with in my time at the department. Most of if it ends up becoming something that the DoD has to care about, then lots of other processes have failed on development assistance, on diplomacy, and so the question is there a role for the department in either supporting allies and partners with adaptation or resilience? Is that something that DoD has any value add and can contribute to? Or is that really a problem that's best left for other agencies? And I don't think there's a sort of settled answer on that, in part because frankly, it's hard to provide additional resources for those other agencies. So the path of least resistance would be to potentially support activities that the department could carry out. I also think that on some level, the decline of the preoccupation with state stability as, kind of the 9/11 era has been superseded by the role of rise of geostrategic competition has made the question of, what's happening inside other states less salient to the department. It's only if it's salient to the extent that does it figure into great power competition? Are those sort of potentially key important places that the U.S. might want to care about as it relates to geostrategic competition? And so there may be more attenuated concerns in the government at present about political stability in other parts of the world, but I think that the genesis of the initial work of climate security sort of grew out of that sense that anarchy anywhere was a problem for the U.S., and that's less likely to be considered true now than it once was, as kind of terrorism has waned as a preoccupation. And so I'm not exactly sure what that means in terms of policy. I think it continues to be something that's debated, like, does political instability anywhere, is that something that the U.S. has to worry about, or do we have to kind of focus eyes on the prize in terms of whether it's what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, or what prospectively could happen in Asia? And so I think that's kind of where we are, at least on the policy side, about whether or not this is something, or problems that escalate from some of these places are ones that we'll ever have to care about again.
Oyston, Joe.
Thank you. I'm a visiting Fulbright scholar here at MIT. We're nearing the end, but to me, you haven't mentioned external factors at all. So You haven't talked about Russia. You haven't talked about the United States, the effects of the Iraq War, the effects of the Arab Spring, the effects of Iran, Hezbollah, the Turkeys, the Kurds. So I'm just wondering how external factors figure into your book, especially this case, because I think Syria and Lebanon is sort of a bad neighborhood, and that do affect the origins of the civil war in Syria.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, as I talked about a little bit, that there were opportunities for the U.S. to respond in the wake of the drought, and it chose not to. But that's only the sort of tip the iceberg in terms of external effects on these particular cases. Obviously, there's a history between the two countries. Syria had occupied Lebanon for many years. There were external effects of large numbers of migrants coming into from Iraq, coming into these countries. So, on some level, it's hard to figure those into the wider argument. I focus mostly on the intersection in this particular chapter on because many of the developments that happen, at least in the Syrian context, with wider role of Russia, happened a little bit later. So this is mostly thinking about the initiation as opposed to the wider politicization of that particular conflict. But the role that external factors play in the book throughout is kind of like the one that I mentioned before, where international actors have choices to decide to contribute aid or not. And in a number of the cases, it's not simply a choice where the local actors decide not to receive aid. For example, that's true in the Myanmar case. In other cases, it's also the choice of the local, of the outside actors not to offer it in the first place. And that's what we see in the Syria case. And we also see that in the Somalia case, where the U.S. government, through the Patriot Act, discouraged international humanitarian groups from providing aid to Somalia in the wake of that drought, because they were worried about diversion of assets to al-Shabaab. So it wasn't simply one of al-Shabaab, saying we don't want assets, which we don't want international assistance. It was also one of the international community pulling back at that moment of crisis. So the international role, it mostly comes through the international assistance vector, at least in this argument. But I'm mindful that there are other complexities of the international environment at the time that I'm abstracting away from, that are, important to bring to bear on a fuller exposition of the cases.
Ron Siegel.
Thank you. You seem to have been concentrating on intrastate conflict brought on by climate grief.
Yeah.
At least so far. Do you also consider interstate conflict in two forms? One is over resources which are becoming more valuable due to climate problems, like the Indus River or the Renaissance Dam.
Right.
And secondly, over unwelcome migration. And it was certainly a factor with Bangladesh in 1971, provoking the Indian intervention. But the Mediterranean and Mexican borders may see a factor of 10 upsurge if we ever get to 3 or 4 degrees of delta T. And that'll cause a lot of grief and mischief.
Yeah, so most of the literature in this space is focused on intrastate violence, as you suggest, and my book is not is in that vein. In part because there was a whole literature of people talking about there will be water wars between countries, and the history of between states has historically been one of water sharing, even in highly albeit unequal. All right. And so there are concerns that in a world of worsening climate change, that problems like the Grand Renaissance Dam are going to be less tractable, and that there's going to be less water between countries and more potentially to fight over. But historically, there haven't been large interstate conflicts over water, and that they've been because of, even along the Indus, India and Pakistan have fought a number of wars, but never over water, and they've been able to kind of bracket that problem. Whether they will be able to in the future with climate change is less clear. And I think there are a lot of, this kind of gets at the last question, there are lots of wider international dynamics, whether it's migration or interstate contestation over water, that I think are worth considering as we expand the issue set in this space. So, the next generation of work on climate security is also focused on responses to climate change. Some of those responses include, sourcing of raw materials like cobalt and lithium from places around the world. That those responses themselves may lead to more social contestation and violence, as it leads to different distributional implications in getting access to those raw materials. So I think that's the next generation of work, is trying to bring some of that back in, albeit with the recognition that hype worries about interstate violence over transnational river basins may be something that we want to avoid making claims about.
Great. Well, this brings us to the end of the seminar. Please join me in thanking Josh for a terrific talk.